This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Amiri Mahnzili, who teaches in the Department of Ethnic Studies at University of California, Riverside. His research and teaching interests range across Pan-African concerns with history, memory, expressive life, and radical political mobilization. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of pedagogy in Black studies, radical politics, and the place of Pan-African intellectual and political work for the history and future of the field. Good afternoon, Amiri. How are you doing today?
I'm well, John. How about yourself?
I'm great. It's such a treat for us to have a chance to get you on the podcast. You know, we've been talking before I hit record, and really interested to hear your perspective on Black studies, sort of how you think about your research and pedagogy in relation to it, and all of these things. And great to have somebody from Southern California on the podcast always, as someone family origins there. So a long way of saying welcome to the podcast, and thank you in advance for making time and for your thoughtfulness in this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, man, I really appreciate y'all having me on. I've been listening to the podcast for some time now. And in fact, between this podcast and between Mark Anthony Neal's Left to Black, those are like my two core resources for staying abreast on what's going on within Black studies. So I appreciate y'all having me.
Oh, if we can be associated with Mark's series, I'm always in favor of that. So Left to Black is, I've told Mark and many people, and Left to Black is really like our model for this. Obviously, we're only audio, but that kind of reach and scope and inquiry. So thank you for that. Well, we'll have a chance to talk about, your sort of thinking and research, teaching in relation to Black studies. But I really wanted to start this podcast with a more personal question, which was just to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And always for me, a part of that, which is what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. For me, it's really centered in my positionality, and within that positionality, I also think about like from a temporal standpoint, right? Like the time that I came of age in Southern California. So with that positionality, right, a Black man, I'm in my early 40s. So I came up in the 80s, 90s, and really my family was very core figures in my groundedness and in my Blackness, right? Like as I think about my maternal grandmother, who's from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who moved to Southern California, I want to say in her early 20s, and the life that she was able to carve out for my mom, which it bled into the life that was carved out for myself, right? They were very much about making sure that I had a very strong sense of self, and I had no type of negative, ill visions of my Blackness or me being a Black individual within this world in an anti-Black society, right? They were very about making sure that I had a pride in myself. I had an uncle who was my mother's brother, always sending me books. My first James Baldwin book came from him. He spent some time in New York, and I remember him sending me back like medallions that were really popular in the hip hop culture at the time, sending me African masks. So I've always had this very strong connection to who I am as an African man. I didn't really vibe with school. I'm gonna just be real with you. Like that wasn't my thing. I graduated high school with like a 1.7 GPA. Being in the Inland Empire, especially at the time that my parents moved to Rancho Cucamonga, it wasn't a lot of Black folks, right? So I went through all of those angst that Black people go through about being the first, so maybe one of two people in the school. And from an intellectual standpoint, that really scarred me, man, because there would be things like, I remember in fourth grade particularly, you're learning of social studies and you're learning about the moment of enslavement. And, they have these caricatures in the book, and they show the enslaved people smiling. And the teacher used that to say like, well, they like their condition as being enslaved people and all of these misnomers. And I remember like everybody in the class looking at me like, yo, is this true? How I'm gonna know how that felt like back then, right?
Mhm.
But these things kind of impressed upon me, like it pushed me out of the classroom. And quite literally, what I would do is I would ditch class and I would go like to the local library, or I would go to the school library and find books on like Marcus Garvey. I would find books on Rastafari. I would find books on Haile Selassie, for the Black Panther Party, and I would just read that instead of being in the classroom. So for me, it showed me like I had a deep commitment and passion for education, but the schooling thing, it wasn't really for me. It was very harmful, in fact. But I played sports. I played football. So in spite of me having a 1.7 GPA, I was still able to play. They still found ways to keep me on the field. And I went into college pursuing athletics, right? And I ended up going to a junior college because my grades were so bad. But in the junior college, I had my first Black Studies class, first Black Studies professor, first Black professor, first Black teacher, period. My whole educational career was in that junior college. I ended up meeting my wife in that class, right? So that was very generative for me, but it showed me that this space of Black intellectualism is welcome within these classrooms. So that was like my first insight into, okay, this could be something. But at the time, I'm still on the football thing. So I went from Chaffey College, which was a junior college in Rancho, to a school in Colorado to play ball for a little bit. It's in Gunnison, Colorado, so it's a very like remote part of Colorado, very white snow, white people. It was just really too much for me. So I left there after one semester, and I went to a HBCU, Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. And that was the first time in the classroom where I felt welcome, right? Where like I could raise my hand, I'm getting called on, and my responses were welcome, they were championed, and it was like an intellectual exchange that took place. So that kind of sparked something in my mind. But I was still out there to play football. And at the time, I was like a practicing like Bobo Ashanti Rasta. So I have like locks and I would wear turbans and all that. But one of the rules on the football team was you could not have locks and you could not have a beard. So I had a full grown beard and a full head of locks, and I was not about to cut my locks for football. So that was the end of my football career. But what I ended up doing was gathering all the people on campus who had locks and kind of forming a social club on campus, just to kind of provide people a knowledge of like the history of locks, their radical origins, talking about the Mau Mau Revolution, talking about, Rastafari and things of that nature. And that moment kind of grew into this thing to where we wanted to help the displaced people of Hurricane Katrina. And we were trying to get the school to support us to go down to New Orleans and try to provide some help. And the school was very reluctant in doing so. And in my activist, dispensation, I just thought, this is what we'll do. We'll take over the chapel. So Jackson State was a church, like a church-based, faith-based school. And so every Wednesday they had chapel. And what we decided to do was stand up in the middle of chapel and ask if they would be willing to support us in our efforts to go down to and assist those in Hurricane Katrina. What I did not know was that particular day at chapel, they were honoring a particular student. The news was there. It was like this really big thing. So we did our little moment, and the news captured and all that, but it made those powers that be very upset. So naturally, I ended up getting kicked out of the school. But everything happens for a reason. I was at that point transitioned back to California, and I attended Cal State LA. And that's where like the activism, the Black intellectual identity all kind of merged. And I was able to see not only like a life for myself within, Pan-African studies, Black studies, but I seen like as a valuable life for myself, right? And I did my undergrad work. I didn't finish. I ended up leaving because I got caught up more in organizing than I did being in school, to be honest with you. I had joined the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and that really, it consumed me. I was more so about organizing work than doing what was necessary in the classroom. And I ended up dropping out of school. But what brought me back was I had a daughter. My daughter was on her way, and I knew that I had to do something. At the time, I was working at Bank of America. I hated it. I was stressed out. I literally went on stress leave because I physically couldn't get up and go to work without feeling sick. So I knew that wasn't sustainable. And I pivoted back. So I was like, man, the only time I felt like I was doing something of purpose was when I was in school. and I was doing this activist work. So I hopped on the metro to go from Ontario back to Cal State LA. And on that metro ride, I ran into my mentor, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush. And I kind of explained to him, like, yo, I got a baby on the way. I'm trying to get back in school. I really don't know what I'm doing. And he said, look, I got you, man. I'm gonna pick you up. I'm gonna show you how this thing works. I'm gonna kind of put you on a path to being an academic. And from there, I got my bachelor's, I got my master's, and I got my PhD, like in a 10-year stint, just trying to provide a life for my family. But ultimately, I would say it was a divine calling with a
Yeah.
exploratory journey, right? Like I was destined to do this work. I was destined to kind of think in this capacity. I always did the work, but the journey kind of took longer than what I anticipated. But it was what divine timing, right? So for me, that's what got me to the discipline. And really what sustains me is just a genuine love for Black people, a love for Black life, right? I mentioned like the temporal aspect, right? I grew up in the mid 80s to the 90s. For me, the culture at that moment was so popping. I mean, like the TV shows. You think about Martin, you think about Living Single, Different World, The Cosby Show. So I was immersed in that world. You think about the music that was coming out in the early '90s, the late '90s, right? I was immersed in all of that. So all of those things really invigorated me in my love for Black culture. I just remember like rushing home to get to the house so I could catch the latest episode of Rap City, right? Like that was like some of my means to connect to these aspects of Blackness that I didn't really have access to because I lived out in the suburbs, right? So those are some of the things that really sparked the way that I viewed the world. One of the core memories that I have was going to the Magic Johnson Theater, was called the Magic Johnson Theater at the time, to go see Malcolm X, right? Like, and that forever impressed upon me the importance of who Malcolm X was, the importance of being able to transform your life, and really just the work of Spike Lee as a whole. You think about Mo Better Blues, you think about School Days, like all of those things were like really core formative experiences that I had that allowed me to see this really robust Black life in a way that's not stagnant, that's not stereotypical, that's really active and alive. And for me, those were some of the forces that not only pushed but also pulled me into this pursuit of Black studies and Black life.
There's so much there. First of all, thank you for all of that. I mean, it's very deep, very personal, and also just massive in terms of the kinds of themes that you've touched on. Right, beginning with how did family create a sense of your own relationship to Blackness is already a Black studies practice, of course, right? And then sort of throughout that trajectory you walked us through, there's so much there about the idea of Black studies as something that really collapses distinctions between the personal and the political, between study and politics, between campus and community, and all of these things. The fact that your mentor sort of says, hey, I got you, we're going to put this plan together for you on the metro, right? The fact that, your hair mattered more than your sport, right? And led you to, or was an expression of, and led you to these various political journeys that then were only sort of satisfied or felt at home in study. I mean, there's so much there. I feel like if we were to transcribe that, or just people listening to it and listening back to it, there's so much there of the story of Black studies. And I really appreciate, by the way, I teach a class pretty regularly on Spike Lee, just on his films, and it's so hard to explain to students how important Malcolm X was. I might have them just listen to that little snippet and just say, the way like going to see Malcolm X was a political event. Because now they see it and they're like, oh, Denzel Washington used to be young and handsome. I'm
Right.
like, yeah, I forgot that he's old now because I'm old too. But that's their reaction. But I'm like, no, I don't think you understand. This was like Spike Lee had to fear for his life.
Yeah.
And there was a worry among white people that this was going to blow everything up. But again, for me, this is the thing I emphasize with students, and you sort of the way you came to that so interesting to me. I didn't see it coming, and so it was like an immense pleasure for me. But the way Black studies is in that very moment,
Yeah.
Going to the Magic Johnson Theater. Magic Johnson, who said there are not enough theaters in black communities, I'm going to make them. Hosting Malcolm X. There's an amazing story woven. I'm sorry I'm going on about it, but that was just a intensely black studies story to be told.
And like, so keep in mind, like I grew up in Rancho, so that's like an hour outside of LA. So it was really an event, right? Like we all packed up in the car and drove, an hour into LA to go see this. And then now, mind you, like this is a Magic Johnson Theater in the '90s, so it's like you're hearing the commentary, you're hearing people speak about, and how black folks are in a movie like that. Be quiet while we don't adhere to that. You know what I'm saying? So you're hearing all of the commentary. Nah, Malcolm, don't go in there. You know what I mean? So you're hearing all of this stuff. It was a really beautiful moment. I'm maybe like 9 or 10 years old, something around there when this takes place. So it was vitally impactful and really shaped me, man. I liken it to how people talk about reading the book for the first time and the impact that it had on them. That was the impact that it had on me seeing the movie, and then really to Spike Lee's credit, right? How much he pulled from the actual text to create that
Yeah.
film is magnificent. Definitely, without question, my favorite film of all time.
This leads really, I think, naturally, organically to this next question, which is I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the sort of portrait or idea of Black studies that you work with, right? Because, the origins of Black studies had this tension built into it. There was the demand by students that campuses have a place to study Black life, and that disciplines had not made this possible, and that was the problem that the Black studies helped address. And that's led to Black studies really being the home for the development of, appreciation of, et cetera, of the Black intellectual tradition. But this was the late 1960s, early 1970s, where, of course, the radicalization of liberation struggle had really collapsed those distinctions between study and activism, between campuses and communities, between ideas and prescriptive actions in revolutionary politics. And so there's that dimension of Black studies, which is committed to a certain kind of political program. And those two things can be at tension, in tension with each other. And I just say tension always because I don't think there's a contradiction, but there's a tension, and tensions we work with in various kinds of ways. And I think that's still with us today when we talk about Black studies, right? It's about the intellectual tradition, but it also always raises that question of like, are you committed to a certain kind of politics if you're going to be in this field? And so all that's a way of really just staging or framing this question of like, for you, what's that portrait you work with? What's the idea of Black studies that you feel connected to and advocate for?
Yeah, I think a lot about when thinking about your question. The work of Maulana Karenga and the introduction to Black studies, which I use a lot Cerritos College, excuse me, and he kind of goes over the overarching goals and approaches to the discipline, and for me, like that kind of speaks to how I view it as well. And one of which is a relevancy, right? Like what we do in the classroom has to relate and has to have some applicability to what's going on in the students' personal lives, in the students' political lives, right? So for me, that clear distinction or clear demarcation between what's happening in the classroom and what's going on in the outside world, I don't abide by that. I like to, collapse that as much as possible. For me, Black studies is politics. There's a political dispensation to that. And I think especially now in our current moment and with the current administration, what they're trying to do, it becomes even more politicized, right? I think good Black studies work will take up some of these questions, some of these themes, and attack them and try to make sense of them. And I think that's what Black studies is designed and supposed to do. I think that's one of the things that we've been hyper sufficient at, right? This clear line that the academy likes to draw, I think it is beneficial for the academy. It's beneficial for those institutions because then they can say those type of things don't belong in this space. And for my understanding of what Black studies is, that's exactly where those type of things belong. This is what we're meant to do. For me, Black studies has always served as like the de facto moral compass of the institutions. We've always had the propensity to make sure that while you're focused on numbers, figures, finances, we're focused on what's right for humanity. We're focusing on what's right for the student, not as someone who occupies your seat, but the student as a full, thriving individual, right? Like, how can I attend to the wholeness of that student, not just making sure they're in my classroom so I get the attendance or whatever that, arbitrary bureaucratic process is. For me, you know, Black studies is about a spiritual endeavor. If I could put it bluntly, like I look at what I do in the classroom as spirit work. I do a lot of research in ancient African epistemologies, and in anti-colonial Africa, the priest and the professor was one entity. So if that is the case, right? If that's what we were doing prior to European invasion, that shouldn't change for me when I step into a classroom that's dealing with themes and topics of African experiences. So if I'm doing my job correctly, and I tell my students this first day of class very bluntly, like, if I'm doing my job correctly, there's a moment in our time together that I will stir your spirit. There's a moment in our time together that you will have an insight into what your purpose is on this planet. And to me, that goes beyond politics, that goes beyond the academy, that goes beyond anything, right? This goes to the divine assignment that it is to be an educator and thinking about African life experiences. So for me, yes, we could talk about politics. It's necessary, right? We could talk about a critique of societal ills. Yes, that's necessary. But ultimately, what I'm trying to do is to allow you to realize and tap into the highest version of who you are. And at the core essence, that's the work that Black Studies can do. That's the work that Black Studies has been designed to do. I believe a lot of the politics that Black folks as a whole take up, yes, there's political thrust behind it, but really what it's about is allowing us to exercise and manifest our highest examples of ourselves. The civil rights movement wasn't just about being able to sit at a certain lunch counter. It was about having us be free, having us to express the highest expressions of who we are, right? And to me, that is the work that Black Studies could do. It should be a divine exchange between student and educator. And that's how I see it.
I love that. I love the content of that. And also, I'm always here for the real elevation of what we do. Because I don't think what you're talking about is melodramatic in terms of what study can do to the whole person. I think I find I have these kind of conversations in various kinds of contexts about what we do as educators, and I find that a lot of people are sort of cynical about that sort of high aspirational language tend to be people who already kind of knew what going to college was like. I have a different story than you, of course, when we all do, but also a very different story for various reasons. But I had no idea what going to college was like. And my entire person was changed by my teachers, by the books I read, by the conversations I had. And I carry that with me. And I see sometimes students roll their eyes at first when I'm like, no, we got the highest aspirations, whatever language I use, whatever language you use. But when in the end, they're like, oh, I see what you meant. That's like a beautiful moment because, you're the first person to sort of talk about it, respond to this question in that way. I think it's so interesting that sense of a transformation of the transformation or cultivation of a full spirit of a person. I mean, the intellectual and the political become really emphatic variations of that. Just to be super philosophical about it, right? Because then you can't separate those two from it. But also, it's like we're not being crass one way or another. We're not just about your book collection. We're not just about what's the issue today, but we're about what all of those things wrapped into a person and a life with vocation. So this is me going on. I love that response. So these already made both these questions and responses of the podcast more than worth it just for those. Well, let me ask in terms of attention, sort of turn it towards you a little bit and ask you, your work is, you've talked, gestured towards it a bit, has this mix of cultural sensibilities, critical work on race and gender, education, commitment to study, to spirituality, to ancestral kind of elements of all of those things. And interested how you think that orientation that you have as a thinker it relates to the past of Black studies. Sort of where does it fit in the tradition, but also what horizons do you think it opens up for the field? What boundaries do you think it pushes?
Hmm. That's a great question. Thinking past, and what I would like to do before I kind of get too deep into that, um, for me, I think of this concept, this Akan, West African concept of Sankofa, right? And Sankofa is this idea of returning to the past to get the knowledge of the past to kind of move it forward. But also, what it does for me, it disrupts this linear understanding of time, right? Like things have to go from the past to the present to the future. So for me, I take a Sankofic temporal assessment of the time of the past and the present and the future, and they're all informing each other at the same time, right? The way that I look at it. So thinking about the origins of Black study and as it pertains to my work, um, you know, it started in struggle, right? Like there was a need that needed to be met or needs that need to be filled, and they took whatever resources, means necessary to go ahead and get that. They created their way. And I look at that and I liken it to my own personal journey into education, right? Like I wasn't welcomed into that space, right? And I think about Stuart Hall, who's widely considered like the father of cultural studies, and he always says like, I came into cultural studies as a problem. And for me, that's how I think about my experiences in the academy. I came into the academy as a problem. Black studies came into the academy as a problem. We had to force our way, right? Nothing was given to
Mm.
us. And that's how I take that impetus and I move it into the classroom currently. And I tell the students like, yo, don't take it for granted that you in this seat. Understand that people struggled, people died, people bled for you to have these spaces. You're on contested ground, right? So
Yeah.
there is a level of rigor and seriousness that has to come with that history. Don't come into my classroom playing, because I'm thinking about those who were in these spaces that weren't supposed to be in these spaces, for those who had to steal knowledge, for those who had to risk their limbs being cut off to be able to occupy and hold a book, right? So that's how I'm thinking about the classroom. So when you're coming into this space, you need to take that level of seriousness into consideration, right? So for me, that how it kind of informs my practice in the present. But then thinking about how this moves the future, I think about the future of those who sat in my classroom. And I tell them this quite literally. Like, so for those who say, I want to go in through K through 12 education, it's very plausible, right? That you may be the educator of my children. You may be the educator of my grandchildren, right? So
Yeah.
the way that I engage you has to be in a certain capacity for the care of my offspring, right? I have to allow you to see your value, your importance, your purpose, because that purpose that you were placed on may in the future lead to my children's success, my children's well-being, right? My children not having to experience the harm that I was exposed to in this K through 12 institution. So, again, for me, this is how I think of things in this cyclical temporal context. Like all of these things are informing each other at the same time, right? The things in the past don't necessarily have to stay in the past, right? The things that are going to be in our future are being shaped by what we do right now. And to me, this is why like things like Afrofuturism is such an important framework to work through in these spaces, because it allows us to take a serious, active agency on the shaping of our future, right? And that's why I love Octavia Butler's work, this idea of shaping. She talks in Earthseed, shape God and shape change. To me, that's the power that Africana studies, Black studies, Pan-African studies allows us to engage in, is being active agents in creating and shaping our future. We don't have to sit back and let things happen, right? We've gotten to where we are because of us being agents in how we seek to shape our future. And to me, I tell students like, yo, y'all got that power. Huey P. Newton and
Mhm.
Bobby Seale was probably younger than y'all when they started the Black Panther Party. So what's your excuse, right? Um,
Yeah.
it's funny in California. I'm thinking about my experiences at UCR. It may be a Black studies class, right? But a lot of the people who are in the seats aren't completely Black. And this summer, I'm teaching a civil rights course. And every student, there's not one Black student in that class. They're predominantly what I call indigenous students. And I tell them, like, one of the core themes of Africana studies is a relevant education, right? So y'all a bunch of indigenous folks learning about the history of the civil rights movement, right? But I also know as indigenous folks in Southern California, you're experiencing unjustified kidnapping and removal off of land, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, if I was y'all, I would be looking at what was being done, what African people were doing to express their agency in the civil rights movement, and thinking about how can I apply that to the experiences of my people in this current moment. And to me, that's a relevancy in pedagogy. That's a relevancy in the material, and also it speaks to the beauty of Africana studies, Black studies, Pan African studies, that even folks who are not Black can benefit from this work, right? And to me, this is how my thinking about the past of Black studies and my work currently shapes what the futures of Black studies will be.
Beautifully put. And I imagine that just placing it on your students' desk like that, this, think about what this means for you. I mean, it's not, the way you sort of came to it there at the end was, this is a core impulse of Black studies and its founding and struggle and its political aims, but it's also, as you said, it's proliferating significance. I love that. So related to that, your graduate work was in a Department of Cultural Studies, right? Which is not a discipline-based education. And your teaching is largely then also in non-disciplinary fields. And so I'm interested in how basically your education and teaching being outside of disciplinary training, right? Not coming from history or English to Black studies, but coming from non-disciplinary places into Black studies or as Black studies. How you think that shaped how you understand a research project, and also how you understand how to put together a classroom, right? What to practice in the classroom, how to construct an idea, right? Whether it's you're writing about it or teaching about it.
So to address the former, right, like as far as research and things of that nature, and I'm thinking about my dissertation experience, things of that nature. A lot of it, I ain't gonna front, it was a struggle, right? I didn't come through a process of matriculating myself through the academic experience from a typical way, right? I never thought of myself as an academic. I never even had a desire for that. So when I found myself in that space trying to produce a dissertation, it was a lot of guerrilla work, man. It was really on some, how can I get what I need to get, without this disciplinary training. But I had really beautiful mentors. I knew how to go to the right person to get what I needed to get, right? But then also from an intellectual standpoint and theoretical standpoint, it was a freedom there, right? I wasn't limited by oh, well, this discipline should be done this way. And now I'm kind of hankered into having to go about it in a certain way. I didn't know. So if I was making a mistake, I wasn't even aware of the mistake, right? I was just doing what I needed to do, and I would get the course correction from my mentors or what have you. So for me, it was a freedom and a liberty that came with not having that disciplinary training. I was just able to go and explore. And I think that's one of the beauties in cultural studies is it's kind of a hodgepodge of multiple disciplines. So you kind of pick up little elements of various things, but you can make it what you need it to be. And then thinking about the classroom, man, I'm gonna be real with you. For me, I'm so glad I didn't come out of a discipline as it pertains to my approach to the classroom. Literally how I approach the classroom. I think about my experiences in K through 12, right? I think about, all of the vicious racism that I experienced, man. Just one tidbit story, right? In 6th grade, I had a teacher who got a brand new Ford Mustang. And, she took us all outside to show us her Mustang and whoop-de-whoop. Get back in the classroom, and she misplaces her keys, but the keys are missing. So mind you, I'm the only Black kid in the class. Who do you think they thought had the keys? Me, right? So first of all, what you gonna do with some car keys in 6th grade? You can't even drive a car. So, that's besides the point.
Yeah.
So these are some of the experiences that I had, and I had to go to the principal's office. Literally, the principal throws me throws on her desk a picture of her house. She puts her car keys of her Cadillac on the desk. She shows me all of the degrees behind her. and she tells me the path that I'm going to be on, I'll be in jail or dead, right? Now, mind you, didn't take the keys, but this is the approach that they had to me as a 10-year-old Black boy, right? So these are some of the harmful experiences that I had to deal with inside of a classroom. So when I think about cultivating a classroom space or intellectual space, I think about how can I do the exact opposite of all of the damaging, harmful things that I've experienced. So instead of reproducing this capitalistic banking system of education where everybody's lined up in rows, what I do is when I can, turn the class into a circle, right? We make a cipher so that way there's no elevated pedagogical person in front of the class pontificating. We're all equal, so we're going to sit in a circle. Before I start class off, we take 5 to 10 minutes and we meditate. I do a guided meditation to kind of ground us in the spirituality of the work that we're about to do. Before I even meditate, I do a check-in. Yo, how are y'all doing? What's going on in your lives today? What got you frustrated? What got you upset, right? Just to recognize them as whole human beings who have experiences that go outside of this classroom. What's going on with your family, with your parents, your family okay? Is there anything that y'all are dealing with that you want us to meditate on as a collective, right? Like, so these are some of the things that I do in the classroom that, for me, because I don't have that disciplinary training, that allows me to be more exploratory, more robust. Again, as I mentioned, from an ancient African context, if the priest and the professor are one, how can I take that knowledge and infuse it in the way that I approach the classroom, right? How am I speaking to the student spirit? How am I providing them access and outlets to what their purpose is on this planet, right? So those are some of the things that I question myself before I start to cultivate the class. And then I'm thinking about how can I address this need as I set the class up, right? What's the power of music in a space? How can music inform my lesson plan before the start of class, right? So these are some of the things that I believe the freedom of not being disciplinary allow me to approach the classroom in a way that's very freed up and radical. And I've had several conversations with students that's like, yo, I've never experienced a classroom like this. And to me, to hear that lets me know that I'm on my path and I'm doing what I've been called to do, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it absolutely does, and it's a beautiful testimony to what it means. Not testimony, really, just description of what it means to go back to some of your earlier comments about what it means to have a sense of education committed to the whole spirit of the person. Right, it has to take account on the front end of not has to, but it ought to take account of so many things on the front end. But also, I'm also struck listening to you talk about that. There's always this thing for me about the non-disciplinary character of Black studies where, I do get snarky colleagues in disciplines sometimes saying it's so easy, you must just go in there and talk about whatever you want to. But I'm like, no, that's actually difficult. Because you might be talking about music one day, an historical document another day, an exchange of letters on a day other than that. It's, the flexibility, that intellectual flexibility that requires is really intense because you don't have a preset path, but also the freedom to make that classroom space, just like making a research project. That freedom is also a really beautiful thing, as much as demanding as it is. It's a difficult freedom that it's been my my part of the profession for over 20 years. It's absolutely worth it. And to bring that sensibility of totality to students in the way you described, I love that. I think that's got to be something that sticks with them.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. And for me, a great depiction of that is like I have certain students I've had maybe 5 classes with them. You know what I'm saying? Every class that I've taught, they're in that classroom. So for me, that's a great indicator of what I'm doing is
experience.
working. Yeah.
No, I've seen students taking multiple classes. I'm like, okay, I'm not fucking up all the time. Right. But also, I had those teachers too, and I went into, it sounds like you have a similar kind of motivation, but like I went into this profession because professors changed my life. I was just going to be a dishwasher and, struggle with, drugs and, getting by if a professor, I mean, just to be honest, if a professor hadn't just said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this," and what did I do? I came back for that. And a whole different sense of self came out, and I didn't have professors, I think, who foregrounded in the way that you're talking about the sense of the total person, but they stumbled into it, and in our relationship, we were able to make that happen. So I think making that the actual method of what we're doing in the classroom is a way to take that next step from what we know as individuals is valuable to make that important to as a huge number of people, and that students from multiple classes. Yeah, that's just like such a delight. I love seeing the roster, and I'm like, hey, I know these three.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I have a couple more questions to wrap up. Let me ask you this one, thinking about the field of Black studies. What do you think that historically the field has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
You know, what is done well, I love two things I'll echo. I love its capacity to critique, right? And I spoke to this a little earlier, but like this notion of being the moral corrective, and that could be from an institutional standpoint,
Yeah.
but also from a societal standpoint. Um, Looking at the way that our society is currently going, I could think of nothing more instructive than the type of tensions, the type of problems, the type of theories that are being produced within Black studies. It is so generative for that. I'm thinking about Achille and Bembe's book Necropolitics, right? He talks about like, we're being situated to where if you cannot commodify yourself, you're being situated for death, right? It's the politics of death if you cannot make yourself a commodity. And to me, there's nothing more spot on than that assessment right there. And if you look at where we're going, if you can't commodify, if you can't make money, don't have no space in this world, And to me, this offering of a social critique is one of the beautiful things that the Black Studies does so well. A lot of Du Bois's work on double consciousness and things of that nature, that's a critique of society that still stands to this day. And that was written in the early 1900s, right? So you cannot tell me that the relevancy of this work is not spot on still, So to me, that's one of the things that Black Studies has done a phenomenal job of. Also, providing outlets for alternative and radical forms of togetherness. Like to me, that's something that I'm very big on. I'm thinking about Fred Moten's Undercommons work, right? Like, yeah, we're going to create a space for us to do this radical work underneath the university, right? Where we're getting pushed out, but we're still going to plan without patrimony, right? We're going to rebel without policy. But what that's really about is forms of togetherness, right? Thinking about Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relations, right? Shared knowledge is what makes and which forms of relations. And to me, Black studies and Black study, right? Like the things that happen outside of the campus as well, right? They're about how do we come together as people and share and shape and produce knowledge. And to me, those are the two pillars that the critique and the capacity to bring us together that Africana Studies has done a phenomenal job of. Um, you know, I, I'm on. I'm back and forth between what it could do better. Part of me feels like I'm not in a space to really offer that up, just because I feel like I'm so not young in the field, but you know what I mean? Like from a professional standpoint, I don't have the experience to see really how these things work, right? Currently serving as adjunct professor at different institutions. There's a level of distance that I have that could be probably generative for me. But what I can say that I always put my eyebrow up is when like forms of institutional respectability politics impact the work that we should be doing, right? So there's like, we don't want to really advocate and put on for our students because we don't want to put ourselves on the negative side with the institution. Right? Nah, later for that. Right? Part of the onus of Africana Studies, of Black Studies, was to be a challenge to the institution. For me, I kind of feel like if I'm in lockstep and key with the institution, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And I think a lot of us, or I've heard or experienced at times, that institutional respectability politics kind of impeding on our capacity to service the whole student, or to service the whole community, or even to keep us from the community, right? Like, why are we doing things that just folks in the academy can access? To me, if you're doing real work, it should be accessible to all, right? It should be something that brings people to the academy because they don't really have access to it. But what you're working on is something that kind of sparks my interest. So let me come and check you out. Or better yet, let me make what I'm working on available to you outside of this campus. Right. So for me, one of the things that I do is a rites of passage program, right? For young boys from about 8 to 18. And a large part of that is taking things that I've learned by having access to academic resources, through having the funds to go to travel to Senegal because of my profession, right? And get information on how they do their rites of passage program and bring it back and make it available to people who don't have access to that information, right? That has nothing to do with the campus. That has nothing to do with the institution, except for them helping me fund that trip, right? But for me, this is like what Moten says, the only rational relationship to the modern university is to steal. Like for me, that's me stealing. This is how I'm gonna
Yeah.
steal this information from this space and make it available to those who don't have it. So what I would love to see is more of that approach, right? Like a guerrilla approach to the institution. I'm here to siphon your resources and make them available to those who don't have it. So, and I'm not saying that it's not taking place, because I don't know what everyone is doing across the parameter of Black studies, but to me, I think if we were all very super intentional about that, only to imagine what that could lead to is a beautiful thought, you know.
That's I almost feel like we should end here because that's such a great imperative to challenge us with. And I think, what the way you sort of got into that too, in terms, and it's come up in a number of podcasts, but this question of, how, Black studies ought to exist at a university. A university without Black studies to me is not a legitimate institution of higher education. I will die on that hill. I don't even think it's a complex question, but how to maintain that while still being, as you put it, a problem to the institution. Now, you said it a few different times in different contexts. How to be a problem for the institution and to the institution. I think that, we passed the 50-year anniversary of the founding of Black Studies. That's part of why we started this podcast, was to sort of take stock. If the next 50 can really think hard and act hard, because it's not just thinking, it's thinking and act hard on that very question of how to be a problem while being in the institution, it's absolutely, for me, just absolutely crucial. And, I always, whenever possible, I like to sort of point to other podcasts in the series, but with the podcast with Corey Walker, he was talking about, one of the original impulses to Black Studies was not just to be in the institution, but to transform the entire idea of what a university is. Right, to create the Black university, and like, what would it mean to embrace that sense of Black studies? Like, you've really, I think, kind of like laid out like some bricks on that path, what that looks like.
Yeah.
So sorry to go on. It's not a podcast with me, but this is, what you're saying. I just, there's so much there. So I'm just thinking live with you on this podcast. Yeah. And how to be a problem and be in the institution. I love that. And maybe that's an answer then to the last question I have here for you, which is, thinking about the future of Black studies, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about? Or what is the question you would want us all to be asking?
Twofold, right? One, how can we continue to get together? How can we continue to create spaces of sharing knowledge? I'm looking at the Negritude movement, and forgive me right now, the name of the two sisters, but like one of the things that were very instrumental in the Negritude movement was like these salons that were created where people would come,
the
gather.
Darnell sisters.
Yes, thank you. Would gather and share space, right? Like that is so foundational and fundamental to our success, to our livelihood, and to how we're going to move things forward. We have to be in a space where we can share ideas, and that kind of leads to my next contention, right? Like, what technology allows us to do is create these spaces in more dynamic ways. We're not limited by, space. But then, with that being said, and I'm seeing this take place, and I'm very excited about how this will continue. But again, thinking about this notion of being a moral corrective, right? We have this thing, AI, that's really running rampant right now, and there's no regulation, there's no real thoughts to the impact, the negative impacts of AI. And I know as a discipline, I'm thinking about the work of Abdul Alimat, and how he thinks about, the future of this discipline and the role of technology, but maintaining this notion of societal critique and providing some avenues for like ethical engagement with AI. Because one of the things that we know, right, those who are producing this aren't don't look like us. They don't have the sensibilities of people of culture. So that can lead for a lot of blind spots, right? And the way that this is moving, those blind spots could have very real implications for our livelihood, right? And so I think, not I think, I know someone within the discipline. I don't know if I have the dispensation for that, but there's someone in the discipline. I'm sure this work is being done, but like a real concerted effort to try to lay out an ethical way to engage this new technology that is running rampant, right? Or even Africans, scholars or Black study scholars sitting down to cultivate their own form of AI technology that could be ethical and more inclusive. So for me, right, the ability to create more dynamic and radical spaces for gathering, and then a very staunch critique and a staunch ethical critique of what this new technology, and I'm thinking about AI in particular, what that means for Black life in the future. What are the benefits and also the shortcomings for Black lives with this new technology? So for me, those two things, if we could kind of grasp that, we're gonna move in a good direction regardless, because that's who we are as a people, right? But I think if we are to look intentionally and conservatively, those two things will kind of open up more spaces for us to exist in a more, I would say, relaxed and actualized way.
What a great place to wrap this up. Very, I mean, you've given us so many imperatives to contemplate in this, which is exactly what Ashley and Bree and I really want out of the podcast, is these moments of really challenging everyone who listens and everyone who's invested in the field of Black studies, study of Black life, Black liberation struggle. It's been a really exemplary conversation that way, Amiri. I really appreciate your time. It's the summer and you take time out of your day to do this, but your thoughtfulness and seriousness in this conversation, I cannot thank you enough. This is such a wonderful contribution to the series. And yeah, I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody listening is going to be like, thank God this one is on the podcast. This is going to give me a lot to think about. So thank you.
No, thank you, John. You and Ashley are doing tremendous work. The rates of podcasts that y'all put out on like a weekly, monthly basis is phenomenal. And I know that's not easy. So continue. The work is vital, work is necessary. And I agree. I think that people will be pleased. I think the ancestors are pleased. And I think that's all is well.
Great. Well, thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.